Welcome to the Women Changing the World podcast, a podcast on a mission to bring you some of the most amazing women I know who are doing incredible things to generally make the world a better place. From corporate sustainability to straight up magic and everything in between, you'll meet the real life humans who are birthing the new. I'm your host, Liz Best, and I'm here to amplify the stories and voices of women who are changing the world. I am seriously so excited for you to listen to today's conversation with Dr. Renée Lertzman, whose work I have been following and inspired by for years. In this conversation, we talk about so many juicy topics. The false theories and data that you might be acting on daily without even realizing it, the 3 A's for change makers and how we may be holding all of them in any given moment, the importance of attunement in change management and how we show up every day. How we convene matters a lot, and you're probably doing it more than you realize. The role of compassionate self-reflection in sustainability and impact work, why our relationship with control matters in how we show up with our stakeholders, what matters about being in community as part of our healing and growth and creation of a better future, how we step into the role of guides, and so much more. Renee is a founder, psychologist, researcher, and strategist who has spent 3 decades investigating one of the most pressing questions of our time. Why do people struggle to act on what they care most deeply about? And what does it actually take to change that? Her answer challenges everything we think we know about motivation, resistance, and human behavior. The problem she has found is not lack of care. It's that care gets buried under anxiety, unprocessed grief, and the weight of impossible feeling choices. And the strategies that we use to overcome that tend to make it worse. Her work, spanning corporations, governments, nonprofits, and communities around the globe, is built on a simple but radical premise. The capacity for change already exists within us, and our job is to unlock it. Renee has advised senior leaders and leadership teams at Google, IKEA, Johnson & Johnson, WWF, Live Nation, and the White House, and her TED Talk, How to Turn Climate Anxiety into Action, has been viewed over 2 million times. She is the author of Environmental Melancholia and the founder of the acclaimed Project Inside Out, seed-funded by the 11th Hour Project and KR Foundation. Her forthcoming book, So You Want to Change the World, Creating the Future You Want from the Inside Out, is the culmination of 30 years of practice and research at the intersection of psychology and planetary change. There are so many gems of wisdom in this conversation. We really could have kept talking for hours and hours, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's a part 2 in our future. I just know you're going to enjoy this conversation with Renee as much as I did, and am so excited for you to tune in. We are in for such a treat on the podcast today. Welcome officially, Renee. It is so wonderful to have you.
Thank you. So good to be here with you.
Our listeners really love hearing the stories of how people came to be in the moment that we find you in. And I know you've had such an interesting journey to the work that you do today, and would love to invite you to tell us about it, to take up space and tell us your story of how you came to be writing this book and doing the work that you do, helping people become guides on climate, which we will talk more about.
Thank you. Really, the work I do, I feel like I can locate it when I was around 20, so quite a while ago, when I was primarily focused on becoming a therapist, a psychologist, and I was, very certain that was going to be my vocation. I was, just all about psychology. I had already been in some sort of psychotherapy at that time and had benefited greatly from it. And I was an undergraduate in college taking all the psych courses, and then happened to take a introduction to environmental studies class, which I've talked about in a number of places, where I sort of found myself in this class being presented with this array of really incredibly intense issues facing our planet, whether that's climate change or deforestation or, issues around toxins or issues around species. Like, it was all feeling very existential, very big, very overwhelming. And I was very confused as to why those working on behalf of those issues on the environment, climate, planetary issues were not in active conversation, collaboration, and partnership with those in the psychology world. That just felt like that disconnect did not make any sense to me at all. And at the time in the late 1980s, it was especially disconnected. And so I would take my psych classes that didn't really talk about environmental issues really much at all. And then I would be in the environmental studies class, outlining all these big issues without really talking about, one, how did we even get here? So what led to these crises we're in? What does that say about us as human beings? What does that tell us about, how humans have behaved? Like, it was just not really going there. And then certainly not talking about the emotional impact of learning about these issues. And so for me, these two worlds just felt totally integrated. And ever since then, I've been very focused on ensuring that they are integrated. So going back to that time, I started carving out this intersection that, you could call it environmental psychology, you can call it climate psychology, you can call it existential psychology. But basically, what does psychology specifically have to offer those of us working on behalf of, making the world better? So that it kind of goes back to that time, in my early 20s. And then since then, it's been the through line. So while I've had many different jobs and, experiences, it's always focused on this underlying question of, for those of us in the change making space, what does it mean to do this work? How can we evolve what we're doing? And what does psychology have to offer to accelerate our impact and our ability to be as effective as possible? So to me, it's like we're in a moment where we're needing to basically update psychology to be suited for our time. And, a lot of what I've seen is that a lot of people, really well-intentioned people, even at very high levels of leadership, are drawing on psychological theories and research and insights that are actually really outdated, and not even knowing that. It's like, but it comes through in the way we frame the questions, the way we talk about how and why people are engaging the way they are not. I hear it in branding agencies, I hear it in supply chain conversations, I hear it in waste, water, circularity. It doesn't even seem to matter. The built environment, green buildings, it's like everyone's kind of asking these questions and not necessarily knowing that a lot of the underpinning assumptions we're making about humans are actually either inaccurate or old and dated from a very different time in the world.
Can you give us like a specific example of that outdated thinking? I would love to wrap my head around one of those old and outdated assumptions that's driving conversations and decision making right now.
Okay, so a good example of that would be if you're asking the question, how do we motivate people?
Mm-hmm.
If you're asking the question, how do we get people to care more about these issues? That is actually based on some underlying assumptions. And if you kind of double click a bit more into that, what you find is that we are still basing our understanding of how and why people respond and engage to these issues based on either what's called the information deficit model, which is that people don't know enough, and if they knew more, they would act, or we're basing it on this notion that people actually really don't care, that there's apathy, and that we have to like make the care, we have to like manufacture the care. And if we are operating with those assumptions, you can see how that leads to very commonly used strategies and tactics, which might look like big campaign to kind of try to quote wake people up or try to inspire people and make people feel really positive and really hopeful. Like these are actually strategies that are based on under some of these underlying assumptions that are dated.
Totally. It's like we are basing our strategy, for example, on trying to make people care, but actually people do care. So that's like not the thing to be strategizing around. It's like, how do you mobilize the people who already care? Like how it's a different question. It's a different premise to build the strategy from.
It's totally different. Yeah. And so the work that I've been doing and developing over time has been really this question of, well, what does it look like to do it differently? And the book I mentioned that I'm writing and the practice that I run in my consultancy and the training and the teaching that I do is really around evolving our toolkit and evolving our repertoire so that we are able to invest our precious resources, time, money, energy, creativity in strategies and ways of working that actually will get us closer to what we want. But this fundamental framing around trying to get people to care is one that, is still very persistent in the spaces of, people who are working on behalf of big systemic change. It's understandable to feel that way. When you look around, it looks like, well, clearly people don't care as much as I do. So what's going on here? And when I say that we need to swap out the underlying research, underlying understanding, what we've learned from psychology, and particularly trauma-informed psychology and trauma-informed research and neuroscience, and this also goes way back to indigenous wisdom and practices as well. It's not actually that new. But what we're starting to be in this process of reclaiming is a recognition of how humans innately care very deeply about a lot of things, including our planet and the future and our children and animals and plants and all of this. But like, what gets in the way of our ability to act on that? And then that takes us into a different territory than trying to make people care. It takes us into a territory of how do we really support people in working through maybe overwhelm or feeling powerless or feeling, cynical or feeling like, well, what difference is it going to make? It's a very different set of problems to be dealing with.
Ooh, yes. It's so interesting to hear you say that because I've been doing so much thinking and like my own theory on why we are where we are is it's the collective action problem. Like it's like a mobilization issue. And I think you've named so many of the personal realities of the things that stop us from mobilizing in the way that we need to mobilize to meet the moment.
Right. And it's a really, right now we're noticing that there's a lot of acknowledgement of like the inner work, right? Whether you call that mental health or you call that emotion or you call that whatever. A number of years ago, there was something called the Inner Development Goals that came into being by a group of Swedish folks. But really, in actuality, and this is also where my work tends to be situated, is there really is no separation of the inner and the outer. And I think we know that intuitively. We know that the way that we show up out in the world is a direct reflection of how we're doing internally. And we also know that there is no individual outside of the context of relationships, whether that's your team or your family or your friends or your community. And so we're at a really incredible moment right now of this growing recognition. And I really see this in your work, especially in the work that you've been doing and building. Your theory of change and your model is a reflection of what I'm talking about, which is being a convener, bringing people together, creating spaces where people feel safe enough to be fully ourselves in in the fullness of our lives, but also recognizing that as humans, we need these spaces to feel, resourced and energized and also equipped So that's kind of what I mean by, well, what would change making look like differently if we applied the science and the psychology? It would look a lot like that. It would look more like, oh, how do I actually bring people together as opposed to pushing things at people?
Oh my goodness, you're going to make me cry. I feel so seen. Thank you so much for saying that. And it is so much more joyful a way, I think, too, of creating change in the world is doing it together. Like this, the heroes, the myth of the hero, and this idea of pushing rocks up hills on our own is like costs us so much from a burnout perspective, from so many angles. It's so much to hold.
And that way of thinking, I think it's really important to acknowledge that when I mentioned that we're drawing on old, dated psychology, that old psychology is a very reductive, masculine. It really comes out of the scientific revolution where, there's this kind of perceived and artificial splitting between, nature and culture and the individual and the collective and emotion and logic. And so this idea that we can do anything on our own, pushing this kind of up the hill, that is from a different time and place, right? We know that that doesn't fit anymore. And yet, I think we find ourselves, a lot of us, especially working inside organizations, almost in between worlds or in between paradigms. So that's what I get excited about helping teams and leaders and organizations do, is figure what that looks like in your particular context.
Totally, totally. Oh, that's so cool. That's so cool to hear. It's funny. There's some fun parallels with the podcast conversation that will just come out before that. We were talking about the world between worlds. And I feel like this is this moment that we're in where it's clear that business as usual continuing is like the worst case scenario and something new must emerge. And we are also in the in between right now, which is tough. It's tough for so many reasons. And actually, I feel like I know one of the things I wanted to talk to you about today is the 3 A's that you've identified that many of us are feeling as we approach and think about doing this work, which are anxiety, ambivalence, and aspiration, which I think on a given day we may be holding all at the same time. But I'd love to hear, when you think about the 3 A's, like what do those words mean in this context, and what do they mean specifically for change makers?
So the 3 A's is a really simple framework that I came up with early in my consultancy when I had just left academia after like 15 years of academic research and, doing papers and all this stuff. And I realized that if I really wanted to work with practitioners, I needed to like bring it into something more applied. And so the story of the 3 A's comes out of when I was teaching my last professorial role at Portland State. I was teaching a class on the psychology of climate change, and I had people keep a journal of just what are they seeing in their life. Like it was almost like a sensitizing journal, like just notice, what are you seeing about climate change, and how does it make you feel, kind of thing. And I remember reading this one entry where the student said, so I just saw this book called 100 Places to See Before They Disappear. My first thought was like, oh my God, this is crazy, to think that there's actually places that are going to be disappearing on the planet. Then she had the thought, well, I really want to get out and see all these places. And then she had it quickly, the next thought was, but in doing so, I would be contributing to the crisis itself. And so I sort of slowed that down. And I realized that what she was expressing is something that we all experience in sometimes like many times a day, which is this sort of, cycling of there's anxiety about, oh my God, this is so overwhelming or scary or whatever. Then there's ambivalence, and ambivalence is in a way the most important piece of the picture, which is where people have conflicts, internal conflicts. And we don't really spend that much time talking about ambivalence in our space, but it literally is the big game changer, because if you talk to anyone in the public health sector and the kind of more behavior change world, everyone knows in those spaces that we all experience ambivalence when it comes to change, which is part of you is moving in one direction, another part of you is moving in another direction. And so that's the second A is ambivalence. So in her case, I want to see the world. I'm a young person and I don't want to contribute to the crisis. And then the third A is aspiration, which is deep down, we aspire to contribute, to have autonomy, to have purpose. There's a lot of things we know already from a ton of research that we aspire to. It's also called self-determination theory. And so all of those three coexist easily at any given time when it comes to facing big, complex system change. And so my use of the three A's is an intervention to get us to break out of being too black and white and reductive about, do I care enough, or do they care enough, or am I motivated enough? Or instead, the question is, well, what three A's might be active and alive right now in myself and in my stakeholders? And I'm telling you, it's like when you start applying the three A's, especially to your stakeholders, it is completely game changing, because you go into your interactions and even your campaign design or whatever, and you're coming from a deeply compassionate place of like, wow, like, I see these are really difficult dilemmas we're wrestling with right now. And that's how you create the conditions for any kind of shift, is that by naming it and by making it explicit and making it discussable in a safe way, without the shame and without the blame, like, oh, I'm a bad person because I still want to fly. It's like, no, I'm a product of my contemporary culture, and yes, of course, part of me still wants to fly. Like, I came of age with, these things. It's a part of our way of being. Like, it doesn't mean that I'm a bad person, but if it's causing me conflict or ambivalence, it suggests that there's a part of me that's not really comfortable with this. And that's something that we want to look at. And then ideally, that's something we would look at in the context of other people, not just ourselves. But that's basically the essence of the three A's, to kind of shift our lens a bit and make it a bit more human and nuanced.
Totally. When I feel like it brings a completely different intentionality to stakeholder engagement too, to really both consider, but also ask what some of the three A's are that people are holding before, I think it can be so often we assume that we know, and rarely do we have perfect information about what's going on with any other person or stakeholder.
Absolutely. Yeah, it changes kind of everything. Like, it changes how you would do surveys. It changes how you would go and listen to people, how you would convene other stakeholders. I call it attuning. The term I use is attuning. I always include some form of attunement if I can, which is, it might be some listening conversations, or it might be a survey, and then share with people what you heard and use those three A's as a map. It's kind of amazing what happens. Like, oh my gosh, that's exactly how I'm feeling, and no one's trying to put me in a hole of like, I care or I don't care, or I'm a good person or I'm a bad person.
Totally. When I know attunement is, I'm like, are all of your things A's? I know they're not, but
I have these 5 guiding principles that I've been creating over the years, and they all kind of fit together. But the first one is attune. So, the first thing we want to do is be attuned to ourselves, to each other, but also attune as a practice, as a tactic, as a strategy. And then the second is reveal. And reveal is about storytelling. It's about communicating. It's about revealing the truth. It's about revealing what's actually going on, but with a lot of skill and compassion and empathy, not just like confronting people with really scary things or being tone deaf by just being a cheerleader. And then the third principle is convene, which is like obviously a lot of what you do, which is this notion of convening as a strategy, convening as a way of working, convening as a very effective way of driving change. And within convene, is skill building around how to be a facilitator, something I feel very strongly about, which is that we develop these new skills, and that anyone in change making should have like baseline facilitation skills, I think.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, it's like essential and very underdeveloped right now in the space, I think. And equip is how do you resource others? So again, that's very similar to what I think you're doing, which is offering tools and resources, and how do you unlock that within a particular community of practice or cohort or team. And then the fifth is sustain, which is really about how do you keep the work going and you get out of that, the burst of energy. Some people I know, colleagues of mine and some very close friends, operate on a very intense cycle of always focusing on the next thing, whether it's a launch or an event or a publication of something. And sustain is about really extending our horizon so that we are more sustainable, but it's also about governance. And it's about ensuring that we have a governance model that is sustainable.
And building in like rest and some cycles into that work as opposed to just always being a sprint, I imagine.
Totally, which is really hard for people working under high stakes and with a lot of pressure, but it's essential. So it's a sustain relates to ways of working as well as governance. So a big part of what I might do with a company would be working, let's say there's a company that starts out with I would call it like a 1.0 model of we've got a office of sustainability or we've got green teams or whatever, and they kind of operate like these little engines that little engine that could, like they're working and they're kind of like pushing things out. And to apply what I'm talking about through the lens of sustain, you actually create a council, right? You create a working group, you create a community of stakeholders that co-own the work with you.
Yeah, totally. And I know something that you're really passionate about within that framework, which I love how artfully you summarized so many key pieces of this work, is this idea that like how we convene is really important. I would love to hear a little bit more of your thinking on like why the how is so important and maybe where we've been missing on the ways that we've been convening up to this point.
Yeah. So how we convene is everything. And I can't say that enough because so many times we gather, we go to conferences and events and so forth, and not always feeling that it was the best use of our time and energy. And we don't really have time for that anymore, I don't think. And also it's totally unnecessary because there are people amongst us who are incredibly skilled and gifted at facilitation. And so I don't think there's any reason we can't be learning these skills and partnering with people who have these skills. But basically, the why convening is everything is it goes back to the real question, which is what are the conditions that truly enable us as humans to access our highest capacities? That question is, I think, the big question. What are the conditions that enable us to unlock our highest capacity? So it's a very different kind of question than how do I get people to care or how do I get buy-in or get people on board? It's really what are the conditions? And so, we actually know a lot about those conditions. We don't have to go out and do a ton of more research. We know what those conditions are. People need to feel safe. They need to feel heard. They need to feel acknowledged. They need to know that there's a really strong, healthy container, meaning like, that could be logistics, agenda, skillful people who know how to handle what happens if there's emotion or people get whatever things happen. That way, those who are in the container can actually focus on what needs to be focused on and not scanning for safety. Because again, this is a trauma-informed approach, which is to say it's an approach that works with how our nervous systems are designed, which is that when we're in group settings, there is always going to be some level of social anxiety, some level of low-grade scanning for safety. That's just basic
Human nature.
Yeah, we've known that for so long, right? And yet we don't necessarily design our convenings and gatherings in the impact space as if that were the case. And then add to it talking about super high stakes things. And then add to it a bunch of people who all have anxiety about different things. They're anxious about what's going on in the world. They're probably feeling anxious about having any impact. There's people who want to fundraise. There's people who need resourcing. Like all of these things are very complex.
It's just like creating anxiety soup, I feel like, as you're describing it.
Exactly. And then we cope. And then we use strategies to cope, right? Which is what you see in a lot of conferences. You've got these big receptions and people trying to network and whatever, it's like, but I'm not even necessarily talking about conferences. I'm talking about how we work, how we do our work. A meeting is a convening. This is a convening. We are convening all the time. And so that's why I did some work with Johnson and Johnson over the past few years, which has been great. And they recognize the need for this. And so I ended up doing a convening sprint for leaders, people who want to get better at convening. Because if you are in the business world, many people are being asked to convene. And they may not have the skills, and by that I mean hosting a working group, doing an offsite, doing a retreat, doing a summit, doing whatever. A lot of people doing really important convenings, and yet may not, know how to design it in a way that gets us where we want to go.
Totally. And I think that the value and potential impact of in-person and virtual, but of convening humans together with what's happening with AI right now, that is something that is going to be so increasingly at a premium. It's so important when you think about the things that cannot be automated away. You cannot automate away designing a container for people, humans, to have a really important conversation and make decisions and move something forward. That requires humans.
Exactly. And I think we're going to just be seeing more and more models of this. Like we already are seeing a proliferation of gatherings and communities and circles and salons and dinners and all kinds of things. I see those coming out every day. So there's a reason for that.
Definitely. Hi, this is Liz, and I am interrupting our episode with a quick public service announcement that if you are listening to this conversation and you find that you want to be in community with other people who care about this stuff, who care about building a better future, who care about showing up as guides, who care about doing the internal work that allows us to create something better in our external worlds, you should absolutely join us at the next Girls Club Collective Community Power Hour. We convene once a season the most generous room of leaders and entrepreneurs and change agents on the planet for real-time reflection, intention, and relationship building in a non-icky and very, very fun virtual space. You can find all the details on our website, girlsclubcollective.co, or go ahead and sign up directly for the next one at girlsclubcollective.co/community-power-hour. We'll also make sure to include the link in the show notes. But just know that if you are here and you want to be around other people who get it and who want to be in community with you too, we built that community, and I would love, love, love to see you in it. I feel like one of the things I've enjoyed reading your writing and thinking about as it relates to our work is the idea of control, which I read about this recently and I was just like, oh my gosh, yes, Renee, you wrote about our desire for control and the ways that it shows up in our change making. It gave me such a light bulb moment. How do you see control showing up for those of us who do this work?
Well, I want to, have a lot of compassion for the controlling part of ourselves. I happen to be one of those people where I can be very controlling. And when people point it out to me, it's not comfortable, right? So I've had to really look at, well, what is really going on? Where is that coming from? And obviously, a lot of what we're talking about goes back to our early childhood. So, again, I'm normalizing that. That shouldn't be a far out thing to acknowledge that we all are formed largely in these early years. And then we end up reproducing these patterns and ways of behaving. And a lot of us felt really out of control when we were children. Quite a number of us were in environments that weren't particularly maybe safe or attuned or whatever. So you have that, but then, I think where it meets change making is really, really important, which is that I think for a lot of us who are working on addressing certain issues, whether that's food or waste or water or animal welfare or whatever, we do want to be able to control what's happening. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. But talking about a different way of being, talking about what I call guiding, which is how to be a much more effective change maker, is to be in that mode of guiding versus telling people what to do. That involves some inner reflection as well about the part of ourselves that wants to have control and tell people what to do, and to be able to be in dialogue with that part of ourselves, not to make it bad or wrong or shame it, but like, yeah, I really care so deeply and I'm really concerned. And there's that energy of protection, like, feeling protective of the planet or feeling protective of vulnerable beings, where it's like there's a fierce quality that can come in, like, but the paradox of being a really next level change maker is you have to be able to let go of some control. A lot of my Substack come out of conversations I'm having with colleagues and friends and clients. And so it was literally an interaction where this colleague of mine, we were in a very deep conversation about, precisely these themes of guiding and shifting into more of an attuned way. And he was like, well, there's a part of me that is just super controlling. And it makes me so anxious to think of loosening, or relaxing that control. And I think there's a part of a lot of us that have that, but we don't maybe talk about it. And so I think it's important to honor that part of ourselves. At the same time, have it become part of our practice to notice the control and to see how can we continue to practice releasing some of that control. So an example of where this comes up right now with a client I'm working with, a multinational, like Fortune 500 company, is, and I'm mentioning that because to give a sense of the scale, right? It's like a very complex world that they're operating in, a lot of variables going on. Oftentimes in these large companies, there's a sustainability team or an ESG team or whatever you call it. These are people who are really highly trained with a very high level of expertise. They've gone through like maybe the master's program or the this or the that, and they're in that role, and they feel like their remit, they signed up to make change happen. That's their assignment. Take it super seriously. And so the idea then of convening people, let's say a bunch of stakeholders from different parts of the business, and saying, hey, we all co-own this work. We can't do this alone. We co-own this. How do these goals relate to what you're working on in your part of the business? There's a need to let go of some control over how that work might be taken up. And otherwise, if you can't let go of that control, you will continue to show up as the compliance police, which literally just turns people off big time and leads to a lot of backlash. It leads to a lot of resistance. And going back to the previous point, people actually really care a lot more than we think they do. But if they feel cornered, and where there's no other option, they will, despite themselves, reject something or push it away or devalue it, and then deep down feel bad about it. And I know this from having done like hundreds of interviews with stakeholders and business leaders. Deep down, at some point, they will say, I know, like, I suck. And we don't want that.
No, not at all. We're thinking about enabling the conditions for people to show up as their highest and best selves. That's the opposite of that.
Yeah, I think it's really important to recognize how we contribute to a dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
Our well-intentioned controlling tendencies contribute to a dynamic that can set things off in such a way where people are not able to fully actualize the care and concern that they have.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I want to talk a little bit more with you about this idea of becoming guides and how we can show up as guides in this work. Before we do, I would love to ask, staying on control for a moment, do you have any tips or recommendations for how we can discern when we are being motivated by a desire to control, or when we're being motivated by like hope for the collective or hope for the future?
I think it's really a practice of tuning into yourself and asking yourself, doing a bit of a check-in, like, where is this coming from? But we can tell usually. And the way you can tell is if it's control, it's stressful.
Mm.
It's a contraction. It's an energetic contraction. I'm just saying, at least that's my experience, is when I'm coming into something and I feel tightness in my jaw, a sort of like a tensing quality. When I am able to notice that and invite this is why we were talking a little bit about grounding and arriving. A big, big, big practice of being a change maker, I think, and I didn't just make this up. This is like Carol Sanford, who, a huge figure in this space. She really talked a lot about making sure that we are resourcing deeply into the root system of like why we're actually doing this. And that's really the root system of love and care and concern and, just feeling deeply connected, feeling one's connection with all of life. And so that feels very different than I need to try to make you feel something or I need to try to force it. Like if I came to this interaction feeling like, oh my God, we have to talk about my book at some point. And if we don't talk about my book, I'm going to be really upset. And like that would be a different energy than if I came in holding it a bit lighter. And I'm not saying we're not holding really high stakes issues. I'm not suggesting not, being connected with that. I'm talking about the quality with which we approach our work.
I mean, I think it's so interesting how much of the personal growth and development and spiritual work that I've done over the past decade or so much of it. And Victoria Song, who wrote Bending Reality, who was on the podcast a couple of years ago, I think, she's like, it's all talking about the same thing. It's about how do we stay in a state of expansion versus a state of contraction, because what becomes possible when we are in a state of expansion, of openness, of curiosity, of possibility, that is like anything is possible energy. And we will move through contractions because we're humans in the world and that's life. But how do we like fully feel into the contraction so we can like process it and return to a state of expansion? I feel like that's very aligned with what you're describing of like, yeah, the control energy is the contraction energy. And how do we collective hope for humanity? That is expansive energy.
Yes. And what we're talking about is really complex. It's like, it's kind of ninja human level evolution, because to me, this is kind of the why we're here. It's like the game in town is like, how do you keep yourself in that place of expansion? Obviously not all the time, but amidst high stakes. Another way of looking at it is Dan Siegel's window of tolerance. Dr. Dan Siegel, who, popularized a lot of neuroscientific ideas, has this framework of the window of tolerance where we all have a window of how much we can tolerate, certain stressors, activation before going into either total collapse or total acting out. And our job is to see how we expand our window as much as possible. And we need each other to be doing that work, right? It's not just like I'm going to go off by myself and like work on expanding my window of tolerance. I mean, some of it is there, but a lot of it is like how we do that socially and relationally.
Absolutely. It's so interesting. I feel like that could totally take me down an untethered soul path with you and the box. But I also want to make sure we talk about this idea of becoming guides and how do we step into, in our change-making work, this role of serving as a guide and not this forcing, muscling, using outdated data and systems and premises to bring about the change we want at all costs.
It starts with self-awareness. So it starts with a practice of compassionate self-awareness, noticing when you fall into what I call yelling, telling, or selling. Another way of describing it in the motivational interview research is the writing reflex, RIGHT, which is when you feel compelled to tell people why something is the right thing to do. It's really a helper reflex. It's really the reflex of being a helper, which is like, oh, let me do that, or let me tell you this, or let me, and it's often coming from that place of wanting to help, right? And so the way to shift out of that is first practicing awareness around it. When am I doing that? And this is why in the practice I do with organizations and teams, we always start with this initial phase of compassionate self-awareness. Like we do some inventory, we do some diagnostics, like, am I a cheerleader? Am I an educator? Am I a writer? Or am I more of a guide? So we have to always start anywhere with that, at least a bit of self-reflection. And then at some point, having a desire to want to shift. There has to be a willingness to say, I would like to do things differently. That's like really huge. Is like just even getting to that point of willingness, which, to be honest, like I have so much respect for and admire, like the people that I'm able to work with, such as some of the leaders, in these companies who have this incredible capacity and courage and humility to say, oh gosh, we can do things differently. We want those people around us to inspire us. So, and then, the essence of guiding is truly about the quality of our presence and our capacity to be truly curious about what's going on with others, and combine that with the skill of knowing how to draw out. So, in a way, guiding is about evoking. So it's a literal flipping of the script. Instead of the yell, tell, sell, and I mean pushing solutions as part of that, to evoking, to say, well, what do you already know? What are you already feeling? Where are you at in your journey? And then to be able to offer resources, expertise, and so forth in the context of, really asking for permission. Like, do you want this? Are you open to this? And usually people will say yes, they are. But that's a key part of guiding is you don't just, share without asking first if it's wanted. So when you think about guiding, I've written about this in my Substack a little bit. How do you translate that to like a major campaign? A really good example would be Dove years ago did a major campaign called Real Beauty. And it was really inspired by the research and work of colleague of mine named Susie Orbach, who is a trained psychoanalytic therapist in the UK. And she had written a book called Fat is a Feminist Issue. And so she started working with Unilever. And that's an example where you have a massive campaign that generated millions, if not more, for Unilever. And the way it did that was by simulating the experience of being guided. Okay, so the way the brand showed up was very attuned. It really spoke very honestly about where women are in relation to their body image. And then it invited all these other consumers to share their stories. And then it just went off from there. I mean, it was just like became this really incredible, groundbreaking campaign. That's what I'm talking about. And that's something that I think we could be doing at all different kinds of scales in our work, whether you're in a major company or whether you're wanting to do something locally in your community, you can be thinking about, well, how do I show up as a guide? Even just that prompt of how can I show up as a guide, I think that in itself can be a very powerful intervention.
Absolutely. I love that question so much. So I have to ask, because I know you said you were not coming in holding this tightly, and I know you were not coming in holding this tightly, but you did mention that you're working on a book. I am so excited about your book. Can you tell us a little bit more about your book?
So the book is called, for now, the working title of the book is So You Want to Change the World, Creating the Future You Want from the Inside Out. And the book is basically walking us through a guide to how to do this work differently. And we start by really exposing compassionately a lot of the assumptions and misconceptions that a lot of people in this change-making space, whether it's climate or the environment or any kind of social issue, are still using. And then we go into these 5 guiding principles I mentioned, and each one is really kind of gets into the science behind it, but also some practical aspects of it and some case studies and stories and individuals who are out there already embodying this work, because there are people embodying this work right now. And so it's important to acknowledge that and celebrate that and kind of see what we can learn. But the book is intended to feel like a really accessible guide or playbook. So I'm thinking like, the Marie Kondo book, The Joy of
Tidying Up. Yeah.
I would like this book to have like a little bit of that vibe where it feels really like a sweet invitation, but yet it's asking you to really change like everything about how you show up in the world as a caring, engaged human being.
Oh my goodness. Well, I'm so excited for it. Is there an estimated publication date yet? Or is that like TBD 2027 and beyond?
Yeah, I think hopefully late 2027.
Cool.
I'm actively writing it now. And so.
Yeah, totally. Oh my gosh. Well, I will plant the seed now that when it comes out, I would love, love, love to do a book launch event with you and talk about it in like a very cozy room with all the vibes.
We should totally do that. I would love that.
That's so cool. Well, Renee, I could talk to you for hours. This has been such a gift. I so appreciate your time. I've looked forward to this conversation for literally years, and I feel like it happened right on time. It just feels like kismet. So thank you, first of all. And I'm curious for people who are listening who want more of your wisdom while we all anxiously await your book release. Where is the best place, or are the best places for people to find you, follow along with you, learn more about all the different ways that you're working in the world right now?
Well, I have a Substack and it's called Becoming Guide. So I would love it if people subscribe to that. And that's also a good way to stay connected, because I will be announcing offerings, and I would like to start putting things out into the world, like master classes and sessions and things like that. So that's probably a really good way. And I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, and my website is reneelertzman.com. People can also contact me there too.
Amazing. Well, thank you. We'll include links to all of the above in the show notes for people who want to keep in touch.
Okay.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. This conversation has been such a gift. I appreciate you.
Yeah, I appreciate you too. Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the Women Changing the World podcast. Please rate and review the podcast wherever you're currently listening to it, and don't forget to subscribe for future episodes. You can find me on Instagram at liz.best, that's lis.best, and you can find Girls Club Collective at girls_club_collective. You can also find us on LinkedIn by searching for Liz Best, that's my name, LASBEST, and Girls Club Collective. Join our mail list by visiting the Girls Club Collective homepage and scrolling down to the bottom. You'll be in the loop on upcoming events, retreats, and opportunities to make magic with us, and you'll also receive a monthly love note from my heart to your inbox. I am so excited to keep in touch.